Hi there, my name is Dan Silverstein and I'm a final year physiotherapy student. In this video, I'll be presenting to you some of the findings of my research into pain, particularly why we feel it and where it comes from. In order to do so, I've likened pain to our senses, which help shape how we perceive what's going on within our bodies and the world around us. I am, of course, referring to sight, hearing, taste, smell, and touch. Now, in addition to these, I would argue that pain is a sixth sense that we all possess, and perhaps at the end of the presentation, you'll see why. The aim of this presentation is to reinforce the concepts covered in your recent lecture on understanding pain. However, I will be explaining them in slightly different ways. If you haven't seen that lecture yet, don't stress. Hopefully this video will provide a good introduction to pain science. Now, I do acknowledge that some of the ideas I present may challenge what you already know. All I ask is that you approach them with an open mind. First up though, I'm going to talk about sight, a sense we're all very familiar with. Let's start off relatively simple. Here we have a diagram showing what is considered to be a typical sensory pathway. It starts with a stimulus, either inside or outside the body, that is detected by a receptor. The receptor then generates multiple electrical signals, which travel along afferent nerve fibers towards the brain, finishing at the thalamus. This area acts as a relay station, further transmitting the signals to relevant regions of the brain. Once the information is processed, the brain then generates an output, or what we perceive as a sensation. If we apply this model to vision, the stimulus is light, which activates specialized receptors called rods and cones within the retina of the eye. Signals are sent down afferent fibers within the optic tract to the thalamus, and then to regions of the brain associated with vision. It's only after the brain has processed these signals that an image is generated. So, rather than the eyes acting as cameras to capture accurate pictures of our surroundings, what we see is really the brain's interpretation of the signals generated by our rods and cones. Note that I mentioned there are multiple regions of the brain involved in the processing of visual information. While it's true that the visual cortices are located within the occipital lobe at the back of the brain, as we'll see later on, these are not the only areas active during visual perception. With that being said, it's also possible for us to generate images without an initial light stimulus. For example, through imagination, or visual imagery as it's described in the literature, we're able to create a subjective experience much like that of visual perception. This is due to similarities in the neural activity underlying both processes. Functional MRI studies have shown that both visual imagery and perception result in activity within the frontal region of the brain. Both processes also produce common activation patterns in numerous parietal regions, which are thought to be involved in visuospatial processing, attention, and spatial working memory. There's also common activation within the parahippocampal, fusiform, and temporal gyri, which are regions associated with storing memories of visual objects. Finally, and most significantly, increased activity of primary visual cortex has been shown during visual imagery, even though participants in these studies had their eyes closed. This all but confirms the brain's ability to generate images in the absence of external stimuli. Now, while there are many similarities in brain activity during both visual imagery and perception, that's not to say the two processes are exactly the same. For example, large regions of occipitotemporal cortex are active during visual perception, but not during visual imagery. It's believed that these cortical regions are involved with object detection and identification. Now, obviously this isn't necessary when you're using your imagination, as you already know what you're visualizing before you form the image in your mind. Also, while it's clear similar regions of the brain are active during both processes, the neural tissue is utilized differently. And this has been reasoned to occur primarily due to a lack of afferent input from the eyes. The next few slides show fMRI data comparing brain activity during visual imagery and perception. Here we can see patterns of neural activation within the frontal regions of the brain. Note that there's 100% correlation for both processes, as indicated by the lack of any colored pixels in the third column. Next is activity within the parietal and temporal regions of the brain. Again, note the high degree of similarity for both visual perception and imagery. And finally, we have patterns of activation within parietal and occipital regions. As I mentioned earlier, there's a lower degree of similarity compared to the other brain areas in terms of neural activity. We experience visual imagery every day, be it in our dreams, recounts, or just general thoughts. If I told you to imagine a dog, for example, you'd be able to draw from long-term memories to produce an image. Now, if that's all the information you're provided, I would bet that the image generated would vary between everyone, as, like I said, these experiences are subjective. However, if I were to tell you to imagine a golden retriever puppy sitting and wearing a white polka-dotted bow tie, I imagine that you'd all create an image similar to this. From past experiences and prior knowledge, we have an idea of what the image would look like. Therefore, what we're able to generate within our imaginations is very similar to what we visually perceive. It is true that vision commonly occurs in response to external light stimuli. However, as we can all attest to, similar experiences are able to be generated in their absence. Now, you may be wondering, why the bow tie? Well, let's shift our focus onto visual perception. When it comes to this process, it's not simply a matter of what you see is what you get. As we saw on previous slides, there are numerous regions of the brain involved with vision, with each contributing to the final product. Subconsciously, your brain calls on all sorts of previous experiences, things you've learned, your expectations, and other sensory inputs. It also draws on explicit memories, the ones that require conscious thought, and implicit memories, the ones that are formed and used unconsciously. All of these things activate neurons in the brain which can modify the information that has been sent from the retina. Therefore, the visual experience is not a direct representation of your surroundings. Rather, it's your brain's interpretation of the information presented to it at that particular point in time. It's a product that makes sense, perhaps only to you. This idea is summed up well when we consider visual illusions. Take the image on the screen, for example. This is known as the Mueller-Lyer illusion. Do the lines look the same length? Even if you've seen this before and you know that they still look different. The way previous experience molds visual perception is not limited to simple geometry. In this image, square A is definitely darker than square B, right? Now what happens when you turn your head to the right? It still looks the same. This illusion shows the way that the brain can modulate information from light hitting the retinas so that it makes sense, rather than give a truly accurate representation of what's happening in front of you. Though squares A and B are actually the same shade of grey, square A appears darker. And this image confirms the two squares are indeed identical. In his explanation as to why one square appears darker than the other, Edward Adelson, the inventor of the illusion, states that the visual system is not very good at being a physical light meter, but that's not its purpose. The important task is to break down the information into meaningful components and thereby perceive the nature of the objects in view. As we'll see later on in the presentation, with a couple of tweaks, this quote is also applicable to pain. Which brings us to the second part of the presentation. Let's have another look at our sensory pathway diagram. In this example, the stimulus is stubbing one's toe, which activates specialist receptors called nociceptors. These are free nerve endings located throughout the periphery that detect dangerous or noxious stimuli. Danger messages are then sent via specialized afferent nerves to the brain. There, they are relayed from the thalamus to relevant brain regions that comprise what is known as the pain neuromatrix. In addition to the incoming danger signals, the brain also takes into account multiple other factors contributing to the overall threat to the body. It's only when there's a sufficient level of threat that a pain output is generated, resulting in a physical, and in this case, emotional response. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the difference between the concepts of pain and nociception. As I alluded to on the previous slide, nociception refers to signals generated in response to noxious stimuli. Now, this can be in the form of direct impact via mechanoreceptors, the most common type of nociceptors, temperature via thermoreceptors, and chemicals via chemoreceptors. Regardless of the type of nociception transmitted to the brain, these signals are generated in response to potential danger to the tissues. They are not pain signals. We're never aware of nociceptive input, whereas it's impossible to have pain and not know about it. If we go back a slide, just like with visual perception, we can see that pain is a product of the brain, i.e., it's the brain that determines when pain is present. This is not to say that nociceptive input is required to trigger a pain response. Just as we're able to generate images without light, it's possible to experience pain in the absence of any danger signals. In this study, subjects were hooked up to what was called a shock generator, which really was just a modified sound system, and told to expect a headache. Importantly, on the front of the machine was a large dial, which could be seen by the participants. Every 5 minutes, the dial would turn, indicating an increase of the perceived shock. What the researchers had created was an environment that predisposed the participants to a painful experience. As the perceived intensity of the signal was increased, so did the measures of reported head pain. Furthermore, the reactivity to the generated shock was even greater for participants who had previously been exposed to stimuli that resulted in pain. In both cases, pain responses had been generated in the absence of any danger signals related to structural damage. Now, with regards to the figure, I should point out that the researchers used their own scale for rating pain, and not the visual analog scale typically used within the literature. Just as similar regions of the brain are active during visual imagery and perception, the same can be said about pain occurring with and without nociceptive input. In this study, pain was induced by either laser pulses or hypnotic suggestion. In both instances, increased activity was detected in regions of the brain shown to be associated with acute pain responses. From the fMRI data, we can see that these are the secondary somatosensory cortex, the insula, the caudal anterior cingulate cortex, and the thalamus. Interestingly, the participants also reported that the location, intensity, and unpleasantness of the painful sensation were similar in both cases. This is suggestive of similar outputs generated by the brain. As with the visual illusions we encountered before, the brain can be tricked into generating a response that's not indicative of what's going on within the environment. In the instance of pain, the output may not be proportionate to the level of threat to the body. This is brilliantly shown in the rubber hand illusion. Let's have a look at it in action. What I'm doing is brushing my assistant's right hand and the rubber hand at exactly the same time in exactly the same area. Slowly but surely, due to multiple sensory inputs from his eyes, skin, muscles, and tendons, my assistant, or more accurately his brain, will begin to recognize the rubber hand as his own. If the rubber hand is then perceived to be under threat, his brain will generate a protective response. So what can we take from this, apart from having a laugh at another's expense? Well, as we've seen, nociception is neither sufficient nor necessary to generate a pain response. In this case, there's obviously no nociceptive input being relayed from the rubber hand, and yet the brain still feels the need to protect it. There was a study where researchers performed the rubber hand illusion while participants underwent fMRI. They were able to show that when the rubber hand was perceived to be under threat, there was increased activity in regions of the brain associated with pain anticipation and anxiety. So what my assistant was feeling during the illusion was very real. If we have a look at the data presented, during the response to threat, there was a significant increase in activity within the anterior cingulate and insular cortices. Sound familiar? These are two of the regions that are involved in the acute pain response. Such neural activity was observed when either the rubber hand or the participant's real hand was perceived to be in danger. This mirrored subjective reports of anxiety and pain experienced by the participants in either context. Let's go back to our brilliant summary of the visual system by Adelson. I said earlier that it was applicable to pain, and, given what's been said in the latter part of this presentation, perhaps you can see why. If we alter the quote to describe the pain system, how it's not a good meter of physical damage, and that the information provides an indicator of a need for action, we can see that the similarities between vision and pain is uncanny. Both are conscious experiences that are based on many complex processes, not just sensory information coming from the periphery or external environment. These all occur outside our awareness or control to produce an output, or response, that makes sense. To finish with, here are the main points I'd like to leave you with. Firstly, and most importantly, pain, like vision, is a product of the brain. It's not the body that determines when something hurts. Next, nociceptors detect and relay signals regarding danger to the body's structures. There's no such thing as pain receptors. These danger signals are neither sufficient nor necessary for the brain to trigger a pain response. In fact, as we've seen throughout the presentation, pain can be generated without any input from the body. And finally, pain is not an indication of structural damage. It may be greater, as was the case with the shock generator and the rubber hand illusion, but it can also be much less. Now, in line with the theme and title of this presentation, we can all say we have a sixth sense to perceive both potential and actual dangers posed to our bodies. This might not be as cool as Cole Sear's ability to see and communicate with the dead in the 1999 thriller The Sixth Sense, but perhaps instead of the famous line, "I see dead people," it'd be more realistic for Cole to say this. If you're interested in learning more about what I've covered in this video, here's a list of the references used. Thanks for watching.